Alright, welcome to a supplementary video. This supplementary video is going to take a look at the introduction to the textbook, what I would call related issue 1. It begins with an introduction and then takes us through a chapter 1 and chapter 2. And for those of you without a textbook, and for those of you that have one, I'd like to highlight some key things. So the textbook begins by talking about an ideology. And an ideology is a set of beliefs, a set of values. It's the way we see the world. It's the way we interpret new things by taking into consideration past experiences and values and assumptions. The term ideology is key to the course, being that our textbook literally is called Perspectives on Ideology. In this course, we'll teach you about a number of different ideologies. One way to teach about ideologies is to show what people would see as a dystopian reality. What would be a flawed reality? And in the introduction to the textbook, they introduce Orwell's 1984. And it's important to collect case studies like Orwell's 1984 and Huxley's Brave New World so that on essays we can present hypothetical evidence as to what the relationship between government and governed should look like. In Orwell's 1984, we end up seeing a government that is so authoritarian, so controlling, that the main character, Winston Smith's life, becomes hollow. And in his hollow life, he has no room for relationships with other citizens because his key relationship is the one to Big Brother, to the state. And through obedience to the state, his life becomes, again, hollow, becomes less. In Huxley's Brave New World, we see another main character, Bernard Shaw, who ends up, again, having a life that on the surface may appear to be ideal, but a closer look will show that there is a flaw to it. And here, once again, the flaw is the loss of individualism. So early on, the textbook takes an opportunity to dive into the world of hypothetical thinking to show the limits of collectivism, as it may end up limiting the extent of the livable nature of our life. The textbook also introduces the concept of human nature, and I often teach my students that, human nature applies to this course in the sense of if this, then what? If mankind is good, or if mankind is evil, if mankind is reasonable, if mankind is violent, if mankind is rational, if mankind is, then what does that mean about the role of government or the structure of government that is needed to control or to maybe even bring out our human nature? If we are bad by nature, then we must maybe need to be controlled. If we are good by nature, then maybe government is there to help further our innate goodness. So that is another concept introduced here. And with regards to nature man is the idea of what is the nature of society. Why did we, leave the bliss of the hunting and gathering life and create modern civilization? What did we gain through the sacrifice of our natural freedom? In the introduction to the course, we introduce some philosophers. We introduce Hobbes, and Hobbes is one of our cast of characters, key characters, and Hobbes has this assumption that mankind is violent, that mankind is irrational, that mankind is in a state of nature, is competitive, and in that state of nature, in that competition, we're at a state of war with each other. And in nature, if we're at a state of war with each other, then we'll never feel safe, and therefore are we truly free? Are we truly free if we're always in danger of each other? That even the mightiest of us must sleep at some point, and in our sleep we may end up meeting our demise. So Hobbes suggests that because by nature we are at a state of war, and without some kind of central control, our lives would be nasty, brutish, and short, brutish and short, and therefore we must have surrendered our natural freedoms to a central authority, a Leviathan, that provides us security. So we've exchanged freedom for security. That's a reoccurring theme. Hobbes is one of few people we'll see this year that values authoritarianism. We also have John Locke. John Locke is kind of a bookend to Hobbes. He is individualism, where Hobbes believes in political collectivism. So Locke would say, no, mankind is reasonable, rational, and therefore the government must govern not only with the consent of the people, but must govern in a way that will help the people further their natural freedoms, to express them, to promote them, to champion them. So we're often going to compare Hobbes and Locke this year. We also have a third character, though, is Rousseau. And Rousseau lived at a time when he walked around France of the 18th century and he observed a malaise. There's something troubling the people. And he argued that the malaise was rooted to greed, to envy, and the source of greed and envy was private property. So one way to apply these new concepts of individualism and collectivism is to say, well, what do these individuals like Rousseau believe about them? Rousseau would say that economic individualism creates greed that ends up creating a malaise of modernity. It creates a division between neighbors. Whereas he values economic collectivism, public property, he does believe in democracy, though. So Rousseau is an individual that is both an individualist politically and a collectivist economically. So that's the introduction to the course. Chapter 1 will get into more detail about ideologies by looking at some themes that all ideologies look at, or about some maybe influences. Sometimes you will see the influences and themes on a multiple choice question, but typically we don't get tested too often on this part of the course. But some of the influences and themes can be things like our nature to man, or sorry, our nature to man's nature to the environment, right? How do we connect to the earth? What is the purpose of the resources around us? We also might have themes like gender or spirituality, or what sense of structure do we see within religion, or what is the purpose of media? And the textbook goes into lots of examples and gives us quotes on these things. But again, on a test, you just have to be able to match them up. Within this source, I see a connection to the importance of language, or within this source, I see a connection to the importance of relationship to land. I don't think you can get those two things confused. They're quite different, right? So I do believe it's quite easy when you get tested on those themes and those influences on ideology. One concept that will come up again that we studied in grade 10 and 11 is the power of the media, and the textbook introduces that. I do want you to consider that the media is meant to be, in a democracy, the watchdog. They sound the alarm when things are bad. In a dictatorship, they are the loudspeaker of government. So the role of media changes depending upon what kind of government you have. Under political individualism, the media is meant to be a voice of accountability. Under political authoritarianism, the media is meant to just further the agenda of the state. But we do have the media compromised in corporate-run countries where corporations control the media. Often the media becomes biased, and they'll spin stories to further the agenda of those who run the corporation, those who own it. So that takes us through chapter 1. In chapter 2, they end up doing a much better job at actually now defining individualism and collectivism. And I would argue that it is important to create a T-chart. On one side, these are the values of individualism. On one side, these are the values of collectivism. And within the T-chart, the main pages within the textbook, the ones that we come back to again and again and again, are pages 71 to 85. And for those of you that are sitting there saying, well, I don't have a textbook, that doesn't help me, I'm about to go over them. So the textbook talks about some of the history behind liberalism, how individualism returns back to Europe as a part of the Renaissance. What was the Renaissance? The Renaissance was a rebirth of Greek thinking. What was Greek thinking? Individualism. So how does individualism come back to Europe? With the fall of Constantinople in 1488, we've got the return of Greek philosophers to Europe, and with them the idea of individualism, a repurposing of life. And one way to really contrast individualism and collectivism is to say, what are the key principles? So the key principles of individualism mean things like rule of law. So what is a rule of law? In Canada, we have a constitution, and in all are equal beneath the Constitution, that the Prime Minister of Canada is not above the Constitution. He or she cannot commit crime without penalty. The rule of law is key to a democracy, because if you have some that are above the law, then we're subject to their tyranny. We're subject to their unlawful behavior. So rule of law means constitutionality. In Canada, we have a monarchy, but even the monarch is subject to the Constitution. We have a constitutional monarchy. So we do have rule of law. Individual rights and freedoms. In Canada, we have the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Individual rights and freedoms is that list in the Charter of our fundamental rights, things like the freedom of expression, the freedom of association and assembly, the freedom of movement, and freedom of religion, and economic freedoms. And in the United States, they have the Bill of Rights, including the First Amendment. And the First Amendment is the freedom of speech, the freedom of religion, the freedom of protest and petition and assembly. And these are meant to be the fundamental building blocks of a free society, that if you take one of those individual rights away, your society becomes hollow, much like those dystopian realities of 1984 and Huxley's Brave New World. So we will be talking about individual rights and freedoms again. You learned about them in grade 11. You learned about them in grade 10. We'll be learning about them this year, more so in chapters 10 and 11. But when we talk about individual rights and freedoms, I don't want you to talk about them just as a package. I want you to be able to specifically talk about, here is a right, freedom of speech. This is why it's key to a democracy. And this is why a democracy may have to take it away. We also have private property, which is more of an economic freedom. That's obviously the right to not only own personal property, but to own private property. And one would say it's the quest for private property that is the building block of the American dream, that it's the accumulation of generational wealth passed down to your children and their children that is the driving force behind why many people work. It's the motivating factor. It's the part of capitalism that works, right? Economic freedom, that you get to make those choices, that I can choose to be a teacher or I can choose to be a carpenter, and that's part of my self-interest. So economic freedom, also a principle of individualism. Self-interest, my greed, I do what's in the best interest of Mr. McBride. And finally, a principle of individualism is competition, that in a free market, we don't want to have a monopoly, because then the freedom is taken from the market. In a free market, we want to see competition, so that in competition we can have more or greater efficiency, and we should be able to see lower prices and innovation as you try to find your niche. So in summary, the principles of individualism: rule of law, individual rights and freedoms, private property, economic freedom, self-interest and competition, these will be tested for you on an A1. So in an A1, you'll be expected to see how you can see those things within the sources. How is this source communicating something about self-interest? Is it reflecting it, saying self-interest is good, or is it rejecting it? Is it challenging the viability or the validity of self-interest? Is it suggesting that because of self-interest, somehow society is flawed? So those are the principles of individualism. We also have some matching principles of collectivism. And the principles of collectivism include economic equality. So instead of inequality that you see in capitalism, you have equality, egalitarianism, the idea that things are equalized, that there shouldn't be great disparity between the rich and the poor, the haves, the have-nots, the 1%, the 99%. Instead, in collectivism economically, you have economic equality. Does it mean that everybody's absolutely equal? Maybe not. Down to the minute level of square footage of house, but there shouldn't be a great gap between your lifestyles. There shouldn't be a great gap in terms of what resources the state provides for you and the quality of life and the standard of living that you get to enjoy. Cooperation, that we work together. This is Karl Marx, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. That's cooperation. That's an essence of collectivism economically. Public instead of private property. Instead of this is McBride's land, get off, this is only for me, this is our land. we share in the wealth, the bounty of it. That's public property. In Canada, we have crown property, right? Crown property. We have public parks. We have public buildings like this school that I'm in that is not owned by the McBride family, but it's owned by the collective, the community, so that all can enjoy in its wealth. We also have collective interest. We do things not for my self-interest, but for the good of the community. It's a collective ethics, right? It's my values, my virtues that instead of furthering me, instead of at the end of the day making decisions on how to promote my own life, I make decisions on how to promote our lives. We have collective responsibility attached to that, that if I see you in trouble, that I have a responsibility, an obligation to be part of the solution. Whereas in a individualist society, I might just walk by you on the side of the street when you're suffering and say, well, it sucks to be you, but I need this money because I'm going to go buy myself a nice steak for dinner. Whereas if you're in a collectivist society, we shouldn't see those extreme gaps between rich and poor, but if we do, then we are forced in a collective responsibility to address that. One could also argue that the term collective responsibility fits into the environmental challenge that is surfacing as a threat to individualism. That globally we are seeing a change in climate, and due to the change in climate, only a collective responsible reaction will ensure mankind's future. And then finally we have adherence to collective norms. Adherence to collective norms mean that instead of being an individual, being unique, being whoever, whatever you want to be, these are the norms that we have set. These are the normal ways that we look or behave, and you adhere to them. You must follow them. So this is very common in authoritarian states that believe in regimentation and collective identity and try to eliminate those individual divisions that may end up dividing us. So that's the second half of Chapter 2. So the main part of Chapter 2 is after Chapter 2, you should know what individualism and collectivism mean. And you should have a running start on that T-chart. So I just thought I'd record this video. I'll put it on, obviously, YouTube, but also put it on our Google Classroom as a guide through the textbook. So again, in summary, Chapter 2, you should know the principles of individualism and collectivism. Chapter 1, you should know about liberalism and some of the influences behind it. And you should be able to begin a cast of characters, also in the introduction to the textbook, including Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau.